Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I'm here today with Albert. Albert is a computational linguist who works at the intersection of indigenous and low resource languages and technology. He holds a PhD from UC Santa Barbara, where he studied how to leverage machine learning methods for language description, and is currently on assignment at Meta working toward omnilinguality in AI powered ASR and MT. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today, Albert. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to you because we got to talk about everything that's going on, computational linguistics. We got to talk about AI and how that's working out and what you're involved in. And I know I have so many questions about it. So in addition to language questions, so I know that we're gonna have a great time chatting. Um, I like to start each episode of the podcast with the same question, which is what is your first language and which languages have you learned to speak?
So I grew up speaking Catalan at home with my parents, my family in school. That's kind of the language that was kind of around me. I learned Spanish in school, but I have kind of an interesting relationship for a long time. I used to say that my Spanish was better than my English, but worse than my Catalan. I do feel like it's this kind of like weird L2, but not really second language.
Okay.
And then also in school, I learned English. And a little bit later, already in high school, there was German, and then I started doing Latin and ancient Greek, and I kind of started really getting interested in like the whole language thing.
Mhm.
And then when I got to college, I did Polish and Russian in my undergrad
Mhm.
with linguistics, and that kind of set me into a whole different route. And later, I moved to Wales. I lived there for a couple of years and I picked up Welsh. I was in a predominantly Welsh speaking area. So these, I would say, Catalan, Spanish, English, Polish, Russian, and Welsh are the ones that I'm fluent in and that I
Mhm.
can speak.
Yeah.
But I've dabbled into so many languages. I did like 6 years of Mandarin. I did German in school. I also did Estonian at a point. I've also done American Sign Language. I just love learning languages. I think that's why I became a linguist. I just enjoy it. And I think at a certain point, when you've learned enough languages, it becomes easier. And
Mhm.
so you get that like probably like that dopamine boost of like, oh,
Yeah.
this is not that hard. I can do more of it or I can go faster.
Yeah. Do you have, because I know that you're very scientific minded, but I feel like for me with languages and even dabbling or learning and being conversational, there's an element of joy in the figuring it out part
Hmm.
and just being able to maybe not to minimize anybody's languages, but for me, it's kind of like a puzzle. And I love
Hmm.
puzzles and I love being able to just kind of know not what people are saying. I'm not a nosy, I'm not a busybody, but like just understanding the functionality of a language on that level is
Yeah.
there's a very specific joy I feel like comes along with that, especially in a world like we're living in right now. It's something that just makes me so happy.
Yeah. I agree. I think it's funny you say that. It takes me back when I was in school and I was like, I love math, but I also love languages. And it seemed like these two things that made no sense because they seemed so different. And I think later, when I started learning like typology or morphology or syntax, and it's that pattern recognition skill, I guess, of just like trying to figure out the different pieces that go into a word
Yeah.
and just being like, and having those aha moments when you're learning a language, or maybe you see like a place name and you go like, oh, these are the pieces that's what the place name means or comes from. Like I
Mhm.
see now, like I can dissect the different pieces in it and it gives me a lot of joy as well.
Yeah, yeah. Do you feel like growing up speaking Catalan, and I know that in Catalonia there's people are so proud of their language and their culture and history, but I would imagine there's an awareness also of bilinguality. You see how I can't get this word? There's an awareness of being bilingual. There's an awareness, I would imagine, because I haven't been, but just as an outsider observing, and just maybe. was there any recognition for you of that from a young age of like this language we're using here in this place with these people, and maybe this language we're using here in this place with other people? And if so, what was that like?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because sometimes I wonder, I kind of have the opposite question in my head, which is how is it like to grow up monolingual? It's not something that I can wrap my head around because as long as I can remember, there's been at least two, if not three languages around me. And it's just so natural to me that you speak different languages to different people, or that everybody speaks multiple languages and that you can mix and match. And, I can speak in Catalan to someone and they might speak back to me in Spanish. And to me, that's the most normal thing in the world.
Hmm.
And then someone who hasn't grown up in that context or hasn't grown in that sociolinguistic environment, they look at you and they're like, what the hell? This makes zero sense. How can you carry on a conversation? So I think that I think when you grow up in an environment where there's a high level of like societal bilingualism, that you're kind of like, even if you're not thinking about language, it's kind of always there. Because I think in the case of Catalan, but I think that's true for a lot of like bilingual situations, there is an imbalance. There is a language that has more institutional power or institutional recognition than the other one. And I think that that is something that I definitely picked up on as a kid. And even just, hearing my parents or my grandparents' stories, like my parents grew up during the dictatorship and they would get beaten up in school if they spoke
Mm.
Catalan, right? And
Hmm.
that's something that for them, they fought to keep the language alive and um, they pass that on to you and it's kind of your responsibility. But then I remember talking to my grandparents who grew up before the Civil War and they went to school before the Civil War during the Second Republic. And my grandma knew how to read and write in Catalan, but struggled in Spanish. So it was kind of the opposite pattern, where my parents to this date, I mean, they can like read and write, but they're not as confident and proficient in Catalan as they are in Spanish. And that's something I remember as a kid. My mom, if my parents had left and they left a note at home when I got back, they're like, oh, there's food in the fridge or something. My mom tended to write those notes in Spanish because it was easier to her. And I remember as a kid was like, why are you writing to me in a language that we don't speak? It just seemed like
Mm. Hmm.
odd. And I think that these things really mold a little bit your experience of, about languages and kind of the different spaces that they occupy, but also the different imbalances. Same with technology, picking up my first phone and being like, why does the phone not speak Catalan? Like, why is it in Spanish but not in Catalan? And I think all these like
Mm.
little experiences really shape how you like put that like language lens on the world and you start thinking about it. Because to you that's normal, that's the most normal
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
But then you meet people who have a different experience and you're like, wait a minute, why why does the phone speak your language but not my language? You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right. And that's so interesting because that's the moment where you kind of realize like, oh, am I different?
Mhm.
Or am I, and maybe I would imagine for some people there was a lot of like identity shift and identity crisis is a dramatic word, but that kind of just understanding your place in a world that's telling you you're different or you're
For sure.
not the quote unquote norm. So there's a lot to unpack there
For
with that.
sure.
And
I think I can make sense of a lot of these things now, having studied linguistics and being a little bit older and having, lived in different places. And sometimes these memories come up and you think like, oh, I understand what was going. I didn't have the tools then. I didn't understand, and maybe there was like some shame that people try to put on you.
yeah.
Um, but for example, I mean, to this day, if you have it's perceived as funny if you have like a Catalan accent speaking Spanish, right? There's like this kind of like, oh, you should speak Spanish with some sort of like standardized accent, and the fact that you have that your first language is influencing how you speak Spanish is considered like worse. But
Mhm.
the opposite is not necessarily true. If someone has a Spanish accent speaking Catalan, it's like somehow it's like, oh, it's great. This person is making an effort to speak Catalan.
Interesting.
And so the same behavior, the same situation doesn't always carry the same like societal meaning
Hmm.
in one direction or in the other, right?
Yeah. Yeah. This is fascinating to me. I got to talk more about this on the show, I think. And because it's really so interesting, so many things that I feel like people take for granted. And it's always interesting for me being here in the US because I don't know any of this stuff. I'm not exposed to it. And the dynamic is something that's so foreign to me. So the only way for me to really even understand it is by having these conversations and, talking to someone who understands it better. But do you feel for you that, you know, navigating this and understanding this and as you're growing up and as you're going through the school system, is this something that directly fueled your interest in lower resource languages or languages that maybe have this this power dynamic with a more standard language or a
For
more
sure.
widely spoken one?
Yeah, I mean, if I think back to when I moved to Wales, there was that moment of reckoning of, if I'm going to be in a predominantly Welsh speaking area, I don't want to be the person that moves in and now only speaks English, because
Mm.
when people do that in Catalonia, when people move there and show zero interest, but about the language, or like making an effort to even just know some greetings, or just like show respect for the local culture, I would get upset. And then I found myself like, oh, I can't be that person now. You know what I mean? I think
Right.
because we all live in contradictions, but that just seemed like one of those moments where there was a mirror in front of me, and so I felt that I really had to make an effort. And I also experienced the benefits of learning the language and just showing respect to the culture. And I felt that I integrated in the local area much better, and I
Hmm.
had an overall better experience. So I think that there is a sensitivity when you grow up in those environments towards other people um, that live also in those contexts. And I think Catalan is a kind of a funny situation because it is, again, there's like an imbalance of power. But when you compare it to other languages in other contexts, it's much better than, the situations that other people face, right?
Yeah,
There
yeah.
is some institutional power. And so, and some communities look up to, the Catalan speaking community for things that, the Catalan government, or, other governments where Catalan is spoken, for some initiatives that they've undertaken over the years.
Yeah.
And so I think it's kind of that kind of middle ground where people look up to you, but also you you kind of share that understanding of like our situation is not that different from each other,
Hmm.
and you may experience the same discrimination, and so you kind of want to help, or you want to at least be an ally when you're in their home, and you want to be able to contribute to learning the language, and making sure that they're not the ones who always have to like change, right? That
Yeah.
they are always the ones who have to bear the burden, if you want, of like switching the language
Yeah.
when they're in their home.
Hmm. And you were in Wales and you managed to become fluent in Welsh.
I did, yeah. Again, that's kind of where having a linguistics background helps, because I think I did most of my learning by just picking up a grammar and just reading. I mean, I went to classes, and I made an effort to go regularly, because you still have to pick up the vocabulary. But I remember most of the people were, English speaker, mostly people from England that had moved to North Wales. And so their reference point was English. And for them, I remember learning gender was like, wait, what do you mean that words are masculine or feminine? It was just like this kind of bizarre context. And to me, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, some things are masculine, some things are feminine, whatever, I'll just learn it.
Hmm.
And similarly with other things, I mean, I know you've had like people talk about Celtic languages in the show, so people will be familiar with like mutations and how some of those things work. And if you have that linguistic background, it's like, oh, okay, so if this is the object, then this is what happens. Okay, whatever. You can pick up things much more quickly.
Hmm.
And then I was fortunate enough that I met a lot of people around me that spoke Welsh, that really supported me in that journey. And I ended up living with a friend who we started as like a language partner. I was helping her learn Spanish, and she was helping me learn Welsh. And then eventually moved in together. And we had this arrangement where we would speak one day in Welsh, and then one day in Spanish, and then one day in Welsh, and then one day in Spanish. So we both had a day that was hard for us, and then a day that
Uh-huh.
was like easier.
Yeah.
And when we had people stay over, it was kind of interesting, because they would see us speaking in Welsh one day, and then we would go to bed, and then the next day it's like, wait, why are you speaking in Spanish today? Like, what's going on? but it really worked for us. It really helped me, learn Welsh, and it really helped her learn Spanish. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I was really fortunate that I had people around me that really supported me and were happy to always, that had the patience because learning a language takes time. It's
Yes. And a
it's
lot of,
faster when you're in an environment where people speak it, but still.
yeah. The patience is you're hitting the nail on the head. That's the key. Having someone who's patient enough to walk with you through your mistakes,
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
humbling moments.
Yeah. And mistakes is also something that you know, I want to connect it to like even like therapy and like my cognitive well-being. I think
Hmm.
that like if you're always in that position of like, oh, I don't want to embarrass myself, it's just going to be extremely hard to learn a language. But when you've learned languages, you start seeing how you become better at taking up new things and just not being embarrassed for making mistakes and just like stumbling because you're going to put yourself in situations where I mean I've said things in Polish that I just like mortified, but in that moment it's just you make a mistake because you confuse two words and suddenly you see the person's face and you go like oh no I but that's a skill I think that then kind of you can use in other aspects of your life in the sense of like, well, sometimes we make a fool out of ourselves, but that's not, it's picking up any skill
Yeah.
has that, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I will admit, I'm still working on that. I have some days where I'm like, I don't care if I make a mistake. And other days I'm like up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like, I can't believe I said that. I'm so stupid. And I have days of beating myself up and then other days where I'm like, whatever. Well, I
What it
can't.
is.
Oh, it's gonna be what it is. But I know that you are really working with indigenous languages, and tell us a bit about how you got started in working with indigenous languages.
Yeah, so I think with that sensitivity about languages and like again growing up speaking Catalan in a Spanish speaking context, I think that I was always interested in like, oh, there's more people that don't necessarily get the microphone, that don't get, that we don't hear from.
Yeah.
And and I think that kind of went along with the process of realizing, oh, what I think I know about linguistics is really skewed towards a certain type of languages. So I think that those two things combined just really piqued my interest in like, okay, what's out there? What other languages out there that are not necessarily getting any attention in the sense of like studying them, but also preserving them. And I think giving people the tools to help them create the infrastructure so they can continue to speak their languages in any and every context they want. And that's kind of what took me into this route of like, okay, how can I be of service, I think, as well.
Mm,
It's not necessarily looking at these languages like, ooh, they're so exotic, they're so different, I want to study them and just
yeah.
like objectify them, but also like, how can I be of service and how can I be an ally in this context? And I have, I think, my experience that can be helpful, but I also want to learn what people need and what it is that they want to see happen.
Hmm.
And so that took me into this whole trajectory of like language documentation and language description and figuring out of yeah, kind of being in that space to support communities through, the toolkit that I had, which was language and linguistics.
Hmm. And what languages and communities have you been able to connect with?
Yeah, so I was predominantly interested in kind of the post-Soviet context. I studied Russian in undergrad, and I think that part of that was also that journey of like, oh, we think of like Russia, this big country, and they speak Russian, but then you start realizing actually there's just like so many different ethnicities and people who, sure, a lot of them speak Russian, but not everybody is Russian. And in fact, in Russian, there's two words to say Russian. There's like quote unquote ethnic Russian, but then there's like citizen of Russia, and those are two different words. Uh,
Oh.
and people actually have on their passport, they'll have like their ethnicity, and then they'll have, their kind of citizenship if you want. And we tend to, we translate them as Russian, but people have like, no, I might be Tatar, but I'm a Russian citizen, but I'm not Russian. I'm not, an ethnic Russian.
Uh-huh.
and I think that kind of that process, and also like having learned Russian is like, oh, I want to put that knowledge to use if I can work in that context. And I think traditionally there haven't been as many Western scholars kind of working in that context again because you need the language.
Okay.
So yeah, learning Russian and then just trying to figure out how to work in that context because I felt that there weren't as many like Western scholars working in that context in Russia. So when I was in Russia, I got connected with the Yukaghir community in northeastern Siberia. So then I started working more closely with them. Around the same time when I was in grad school at UC Santa Barbara, there were like different collaborations with migrant communities from southern Mexico
Mhm.
that predominantly speak Mixtec, uh, but then also like some other languages like Purepecha. And so I kind of started collaborating with the local Mixtec community as well, which is a kind of a very different context in the sense that, there's a migration piece in there. But that was also just kind of a very interesting experience to kind of understand the realities of those people and like figure out ways of supporting people and that kind of intergenerational transmission of the language when people have migrated from where the language is typically
Yeah.
spoken, right?
Yeah. I want to go back to Russia for a second because I did not know that there was that distinction between being ethnically Russian or a Russian citizen, which
Hmm.
is like, who knew? Um, I'm sure plenty of people knew this. I did not know this. But you're working with the Yukaghir community in Russia and Siberia. Um, and I'd love to know maybe not so much like what that was like, but what kind of like I'm trying to figure out the context between being Russian citizen and not Russian ethnically, but then having this community that's a big community. I'm assuming it's a big community, more or less.
Ish.
Ish, big-ish community. I mean, because Russia's huge, like
Right,
landmass wise. And Siberia is gigantic. So I'm assuming that there's a lot of language that's being spoken in a part of Russia that is not like the part of Russia that's closer to Europe. And
right.
so making a huge assumption here that that part of Russia might get severely overlooked.
Oh,
So I'm,
100%.
yeah, I'm just from your observation and understanding that you're not ethnically a part of this community. So I don't want you to feel like you have the weight of speaking for this entire community on your shoulders, but I guess trying to understand in a language and culture dynamic and being in this region that's again not as close to Europe as we think as outsiders we think of what Russia means, like what were you observing there?
Yeah, so maybe I can paint a little bit of a picture of that part of Russia because again, I mean, Siberia is massive, and also what we call Siberia and how we think of Siberia is different from how people talk about Siberia and think about Siberia in Russia. Because people in Russia tend to kind of separate or dissect um, everything that's past the Ural Mountains. It's like, yes, there's Siberia, but then there's the north. So that's all the Arctic regions that that they don't consider that Siberia.
Okay.
And then that's what they call the Far East. So that would be kind of all the areas kind of neighboring the Pacific Ocean. So think all the areas in front of Alaska, north of North Korea and Japan, and that kind of creeps into, it's a quite big area, what they would consider the Far East.
Okay.
The area where the Yukaghires live is predominantly part of what's called the Republic of Sakha Yakutia, which is it's actually the biggest subnational entity in the world. I think it's almost as big as India. I mean, it's insanely big, and there's about, I think, 900,000 people that live there, not even a million, and I
Hmm.
think about 300,000 live in the capital city of Yakutsk. So imagine this massive piece of land where a third of the population live in the capital, and then the rest is just, I mean, it's so incredibly sparsely populated.
Hmm.
It has some of the coldest temperatures on record have been recorded there. And we're talking like real cold.
I
So
bet.
it's a very and also very hot in the summer, which is something that people don't realize. I mean, it can get into like 100, 110 Fahrenheit in the summer. Like
Wow.
it can easily get into like the 30s and 40s Celsius. I mean, it
Mhm.
gets very hot. It's quite a brutal landscape. So that's kind of just to kind of give a big picture. The majority of the people who live in that region are Sahas. Um, so they're the dominant ethnic group, and then there's different groups that are smaller, and the Yukaghir are the smallest of them all. And so historically, there's also been this kind of different system of hierarchies in the area between like different ethnic groups and also who learned whose languages, basically.
Okay.
So the Yukaghir kind of ended up because they were the smallest ethnic group, they were at kind of the bottom of this kind of societal structure. So they were more likely to know everyone else's languages because people wouldn't learn Yukaghir, they would learn other people's languages.
Okay.
Um, with the arrival, with the colonization of Siberia by the Russians, kind of a lot of those structures changed. So now there's less multilingualism and there's more bilingualism where people speak their language and then Russian.
Yeah.
But you still see, I mean, it's not uncommon that you find people that speak five, six different languages. You'll find people that speak Chukchi and Yukaghir and Russian and maybe Sakha. I mean, people are highly, highly multilingual. It's kind of interesting because Yukaghir is also a language isolate. Well, there's two sister languages called Ima Yukaghir and Tundra Yukaghir, and
Hmm.
they're related to each other. They didn't know about the other's existence for a very long time because they're quite far away from each other.
Yeah.
And I think it was about around the 60s that they kind of learned that there was another community. And now there's a sense of like, oh, we are part of the same ethnic group. But so the languages are very, very different from other neighboring languages, and they kind of have been influenced as well because they were highly multilingual. So that's kind of one piece of it. The other ethnic groups that live in the area have included the Evans and the Evenki, not so much the Evenki, a little bit more in the south. And then, as I mentioned, Chukchis. And all of these languages they belong to different language families. So
Okay.
Yukaghir is a language isolate, but then Chukchi is part of this Paleo-Siberian language family that is not really a family. It was more like all these languages that are so different we don't know where they are. They just put them in the same place. Um, Actually, if I could correct myself, Yukaghir is put in that Paleo-Siberian, and then Chukchi, if I remember correctly, is part of the Kamchatka. And then there's the Tungusic languages, and then there's the Turkic languages. So it's like a really kind of interesting area in terms of the linguistic diversity.
Yeah.
I think it's an area. I mean, I think kind of through learning Russian, it opened that area of the world for me.
Mhm.
And I think it's an area that it's like, oh, it's just cold and there's nothing there. It's kind
Mhm.
of this kind of popular idea. Um, and and sure, yeah, it's big and it's sparsely populated and the climate is very extreme, but there are lots of people that have made it home,
Yeah.
through different ways. I mean, the Yukaghir are believed to be some of the first settlers of that part of the Arctic. And then some of the Tungusic people arrived, so like the Evans and Evenkis, and they are traditionally reindeer herders, whereas the Yukaghir were not. The Yukaghir were traditionally foragers and hunters and fishers.
Mhm.
And then later the Saha, which are Turkic, arrived, and each brought their own lifestyle and their different ways of living with the land and in the land. And you kind of see that in the languages as well. I mean, if you look at Sakha, for example, we know it's a Turkic language. It's very, very far away from all the other Turkic languages because when we talk about Turkic, we think like Turkish, Kazakh, Uzbek, Uyghur. We kind of think like Central Asia and then kind of some peripheral areas around it. This
Mhm.
is very far away. So
Yeah.
we know that they migrated from that area.
Mhm.
And we can reconstruct a little bit of their journey by looking at, the loan words that they picked up on. So we see a decent amount of Mongolian loan words. So we know that they must have traveled first east and they shared their space with speakers of Mongolian languages before they started migrating north,
Right.
right? Because if they had migrated first north and then east, we wouldn't necessarily see that influence, right?
Right.
Uh, so you definitely can see those histories. And again, like in some cases there isn't like written history, right? So we have to reconstruct. We can use language to reconstruct some of that history through the linguistic structures.
Mhm.
Often it's that whole area is often called like a language area because the languages, even though they're not related to each other, they kind of have converged into specific patterns. And one of the hypotheses is that the event in particular were this kind of vector of diffusion, that the closer or the more in contact you were with event, you were more likely to kind of experience some of these changes, and the further away, the kind of the like the smaller the influence, if you want.
Really?
And part of it is because the event just, I mean, they were nomadic, like most people in the area, and they, the area that they would go around was
Mhm.
massive.
Yeah.
And so, through all these contacts over time, the languages kind of became more similar, even though they're completely unrelated, most of them to one another.
Were the event the only nomadic group that would, or were they the most widely traveled one in the?
Most groups were nomadic, not the Saha as far as I know, but most of the smaller ethnic groups were nomadic. The event in the Evenki, I think, would occupy the biggest areas that they moved around. But I think to a certain extent, most of the people were, and I think it's also, you kind of have to adjust to the land
Mhm.
in such harsh conditions.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to ask you about adjusting to the land. Well, you said adjusting to the land makes me realize I wanted to ask you about climate change
Oh yeah.
and how do you know or how have you observed that the language or the speaking it, communicating, or any other things that are related to these languages and these groups, how has climate change affected that?
It definitely is in lots of different ways. And you have to think about the fact that like most of the area, you kind of, it's there's the permafrost, right? So the soil doesn't, it never really melts, even in the summer when it's hot. There's like a thick layer that is just permanently frozen. And so the way that people have had to build settlements, especially more recently, um, have had to adapt to that. So you don't necessarily have those like very deep kind of pillars that go into the ground because you just can't drill into the ice. And instead you have like shorter pillars, but you have more of them.
Hmm.
But with climate change, one of the things that has happened is that some of the permafrost or the upper layers have started to melt. And so buildings are now collapsing because they're built, you know, with the assumption that the ground is frozen, right?
Yeah.
And now it's melting, and so that way of building no longer can sustain like bigger buildings, for example.
Hmm.
With that, it's also like some of the stuff that was frozen is now coming up, and so you're walking around and you'll find like these uneven surfaces because there's like gases that are coming out, but then they get trapped.
Hmm.
And so you kind of have these images of what it was maybe 50 years ago and what is now, and what used to be like a completely smooth or like flat surface is now just all, I don't even know what word to describe that, but you have all these like pockets of stuff that are coming up and it's
Hmm.
no longer even. So it's creating like a very kind of definite impact on just the landscape itself. It's also creating economic pressure in the sense that with the Arctic Sea melting, um, Russia is very interested in having that as a commercial route that goes, to ship stuff from China to Europe because it's a much faster route than to go around. And also, I think we're seeing now with the conflict in the Middle East that it is a challenging area. There's like that geopolitics piece of it. And so Russia has been investing very heavily with developing the north, the Arctic coast, with harbors and infrastructure. And so that brings more outsiders, more ethnic Russians, or people who are not necessarily like local members. So it's creating all these like economic pressures as well on people. And of course, that's going to have an effect on the language and the
Yeah.
landscape,
I
right?
was thinking that too, like how that's accelerating or potentially could accelerate the way that people communicate
Right.
and have people strive to hold on to their language or even learn their language or encourage the next generation
Right.
uh to speak this language because economic opportunities is hard to ignore.
Yeah.
So it
100%.
it definitely changes the linguistic landscape. Um, so the from what you've experienced in this part of the world, in Russia, in Siberia, in the Arctic, 110-degree summers, never getting over that. From what you learned in this part of the world to what you've learned where you are now, and you're working with indigenous languages in a completely different context,
Mhm.
on another continent, how has that been? And what have you been able to take from one and apply to the other, or vice versa?
Yeah, I think it definitely has shaped how I think about languages. And I
Hmm.
think there is, I think it's about like 15 years old now. There was this research that started, I think, in psychology about this idea of like weird societies, like Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And they create this acronym and how so much of the psychology studies had relied on, undergraduate students, especially in the US, and how what we thought about psychology was and how cognition worked was just
Hmm.
like highly, highly skewed.
Okay.
And I think as with that, there was also this reckoning in linguistics of like actually we have based so much about what linguistics is on a small group of languages, predominantly, languages of Western Europe. And and that has and some of the things that we see in Europe again are they're very common in Europe, but they're very rare outside of Europe.
Hmm.
And I think when you start studying, Mixtec or Yukaghir, which are languages that are completely different. I mean, Mixtec is tonal, is kind of more isolating. Yukaghir is highly agglutinating. I mean, they're just like completely, completely different types of languages. But it really challenges what you think languages is or quote unquote should be based on the theory. And I find this kind of English paradox almost, where so much of linguistics has relied on like, oh, English is so weird that we should study English, but at the same time, English is just so generic and we can generalize so much from English that we just need to study English.
Hmm.
And so either way you find yourself studying English because of these like two completely different ideas, right?
Yeah.
And and even like when you look at computational linguistics, you see that and I think probably not just in computational linguistics, but people will write about some sort of research and they will call it, I don't know, something about nominalizations or whatever it is. Um, and it's just about English, but they will never tell you in the title that it's about English. But if you write
Hmm.
about mistake, people will like, oh, you actually have to, this is specifically about this language, right?
Right,
So there's
right.
this bias that if you study a language, you do theory, whereas if you study another language, you're just doing some sort of like typological work. And I think that we have to be able to kind of move past that and just really lift up all these other languages and study them with the same principles and through the same lens and just acknowledge that they give us an insight into how insane this thing that we can do is and looks like and all the different ways that pops up around the world, right?
Hmm.
Because language is quite, I mean, it's really unique to us. And yet, I think there's this quote that if we studied tomatoes and nettle, I think, and we try to make this generalization about how plants are, it's kind of like laughable. And yeah, that's kind of what we do with languages, right? We study a small pocket of languages and we paint this picture of how they all are when we haven't really spent the time understanding
Hmm.
all these different ways and how they challenge the views that we have about
Hmm.
anything really. Like,
Yeah.
do nouns and verbs and adjectives exist? And it's just like, oh, it's very easy to say yes because of all the ways in which like European languages work. But then you start looking at Yukaghir and you start being like, oh, maybe there are words that behave similarly, but maybe they're not they don't quite align in the same ways with the categories that we use for European languages.
What does that look like to approach this kind of linguistic data or approach linguistics in such a way that does not center English? What does that look like in practice? Or how
Yeah.
can that look like in practice? Either one.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is just sitting with the language and just doing it bottom up, if you will, in the sense of um, just writing it and figuring out, what we were talking about earlier, figuring out the pieces, figuring out how words relate to each other. And having that like theory, obviously, is helpful because it gives you uh, an expectation of what is more likely or less likely to appear. But I think that you have to have that like you have to be careful not to jump to conclusions too early, and or you have to be able to like if you jump to a conclusion, it's your hypothesis if you want. And then if you find new pieces of the language that contradict that, you have to be humble enough to go back and revisit that and be like, actually, I thought that this behaved this way, but now I have this piece of information that tells me that not so quite, right? And we know that in fact in a lot of things in language have this Zipfian distribution. We know that about like sounds and we know that about a lot of linguistic structures that there's some things that are very, very, very common, but then as we go into more and more things, there's this long tail of phenomena that are not used as much. They exist, but they're not used as much. And so you can collect all these like language data, and of course you're going to be able to find a lot of the same things, but you might only have one examples of two examples of like less common phenomena, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to be open to finding, you record more and then you find things that kind of contradict or just nuance some of the things that you believed were true earlier when you had a lot of that one thing, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of it is just kind of sitting with the data, if you want, in like a very scientific way. You just have to sit with the language and understand it and talk to people. I think at the end of the day, speakers know so much about their
Yeah.
language, and
Yeah.
and you have to. I think that there's almost this, I don't know, I don't want to say contempt, but I think that there's often like, oh, I'm the scientific person here. I'm the I'm the one who knows about linguistics, and I'm the one who can like dissect words. And there's this kind of deference almost to the speaker, right? And
Mm.
at the end of the day, we know so much about the languages that we speak because we've grown up with them. I mean, it's part of they've shaped us in so many different ways. And I think that we have to be open to the insights that they have because they have so many. And people I think are quick to disregard those
Yeah.
in when they study and describe languages and try to make sense of them.
Mm-hmm. This is going to be so important in the coming years because we're seeing people who, well, we're going to talk about AI in a second, but but I think we're seeing people who, like you said, listen to the people who speak the language because, I think I don't think as people migrate and people move into new areas and come into new areas, even for a short period of time. I'll give you the example from my non-professional brain. I'm a lifelong New Yorker, right? I've been here forever. And every now and then I'll hear people say something like, New Yorkers never said this,
Mm.
whatever phrase. And this is probably not a great example, but it's what I can work with at the moment. Um, and I'll say to myself, 30, back in the 90s, New Yorkers never said this. And I'll say, yeah, we did. We did
Right,
say this. I distinctly remember I can pull out my yearbook from junior high school and I can
right,
show you where, people were quoting this certain thing. And I think that sometimes collective memory can shift and it can move. And I think about how important, I'm saying all this to say, I think about how important it is to have research that documents these things and writes these things down because people collectively uh, may remember things differently,
right,
um, or feel like they can say whatever they want because we're in this new age of uh,
right.
stuff.
It's a little like, is it the Mandela effect when people collectively believe that something was a certain way when it wasn't that way? I think there's something to it with language for sure.
Right, absolutely. And I think that can be a big one in a rapidly changing community or rapidly changing city, like New York in this example, which is so different now than it was, 20 years ago, which doesn't sound rapid, but it's a generation, so it
For
is
sure.
a rapid change. So in language technology, in language, in linguistics, we hear the term low resource languages. And I'm assuming that means languages with limited digital data or limited data. So, what do you think it would be like to design a technology with low resource languages in mind from the beginning? And maybe, why are these languages being treated as an afterthought?
Yeah, I mean, big question.
That's a big question. I'm sorry.
No, no. I mean, these are things that I ask myself that I'm trying to wrap my head around as well as I'm, in this kind of AI space now. I think, and I think it's a good segue from what you were saying. One of the things that I wanted to say when you talk about this New York example is we're also very biased when we think about language. We think about standard language, we think about writing.
Mm,
We often disregard what people say, and that's not quote unquote good language.
yeah.
But like what people write is good language, right? And
Mhm.
I think that these types of ideas and ideologies have, moved on to how we now have, or like the technologies that we're building, because they kind of are built on this history of writing, right? That not every language community has or has had in the same way. And so, because of that, I think a lot of the specifically in AI, but I think that extends to like a lot of language technology, has a lot of it has been built on like massive amount of data, right? Because we have massive amount of like English data, German data, Spanish data, whatever. I mean, again, it's always the same suspects.
Mhm.
And so that has put languages that don't have that breadth of written language in this situation, like quote unquote low resource, right?
Mhm.
Um, because we've built technologies that rely on such massive amount of data, we can't build the same thing unless we have, again, the same amount of data for those languages. I think that the things are changing, I think in general. We've been talking about all these like large language models, but now there's all this talk about like, oh, maybe small language models are
Hmm.
actually they might be able to perform similarly and rely on like less parameters, less data, less weights, etc. And I think that there is in general this reckoning that like, sure, you can always collect more data, but at some point it's just not going to scale linearly. And so I think that that puts this question of low risk languages in this position of like, well, how can we build technologies for these languages with the amount of data that we have? And sure, we can collect more, we can transcribe more, we can record more, we can expand the data. Um, but I think there's an interesting question of like, what happens when we center these languages and what we have to build technology? And I think that there's interesting questions that come up. Again, I think a lot of what language technology is or has been built on goes back to, if we think like Harris and like the 1950s and the distributional hypothesis, this idea that words that appear in the same context are likely going to be, words of the same type. And that works very well for English because of, we have all these like little words that connect other words, like the ofs and thes and ins of the sentence, right? And those are very common. And amazingly, they're separated by white space, which is something that we can very easily use computationally to like separate words. And so we end up having this definition of a word that is whatever is surrounded by white space.
Mhm.
But again, that's a quirk of English and not all languages. That works very well for English. But what happens when, again, if we think about languages of Siberia, you have a word that is basically has five, six, seven, eight, nine, 10 pieces in it, and it's just basically a sentence, right?
Yeah.
And so you now don't have white spaces, you don't have uh, how do you chunk the pieces in that, right? And I think that there isn't a clear answer as to like how do we center technology or language technologies around low resource languages. But I think that we have to start by thinking and knowing how these languages look like,
Hmm.
how much data there is, and how much spoken recordings there are, how much written recordings there are, and thinking about how we can leverage them in ways that are effective. And I think that there's a lot of interesting research. I find myself, I tell you these things of like, oh, maybe if we had started building, if Silicon Valley was in Siberia and they spoke Chukchi or Yukaghir, maybe technology would be very different because those languages are very different. At the same time, there's research showing that in some unsupervised machine translation, uh, people are able to like vectorize uh, different languages and end up in the same space. And so you have words that tend to mean the same thing in different languages ending up in the same vector space, which would suggest that, there is some sort of core piece in some sort of way. So I find myself like wrapping my head around like what is the way forward here. I think there's also this kind of bias towards like urban context in the sense of like if we look about a lot of the recordings that we have for a lot of languages, people are talking about like more traditional types of activities because that's like the lifestyle in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases.
Hmm.
And when new terms appear, they often appear in other languages because they're like borrowed from English or for whatever, other local language. And so there's also this kind of tension in the sense of like we build all these like benchmarks and we build all these like ways of testing and making sure that these models are performing to a certain standard that skews so heavily towards certain content uh, that there's ways to talk about, I don't know, growing vegetables in English, but these things never really quite make it to
Hmm.
these benchmarks, right?
Hmm.
And so we kind of end up also with this kind of like different ways of measuring that I think are a little bit quote unquote unfair, if you want, that we're
Okay.
kind of holding these languages to a standard that they might not necessarily be able to perform in this kind of like language technology space
Hmm.
because we're not leveraging the information, the cultural knowledge, and the words that we do have.
Right. Right. Is there, boy, oh boy.
It's a
No,
lot.
it's a lot. It's a lot. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen that some indigenous communities want tech to do for them, or how they anticipate that tech can help?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's places where people are excited about like having some speech recognition or like having some machine translation capabilities so they can maybe access materials that they wouldn't be able to access if there's been some sort of like process of language substitution,
Hmm.
right? And maybe there's like second language speakers who maybe their grandparents spoke the language, their parents didn't, and they're trying to like regain and reclaim the language. And so some communities see that as like a tool that can help them. Um, I think you see a lot of differences, for example, like thinking about North America, where there's been a lot of like extraction and the experiences that a lot of communities have gone through have put them in a position of like distrust, which is completely understandable. And I'm not saying this as like as a critique.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas if you look at places like Siberia, where the history has been different, and of course there has still has been colonization and there still has been extraction, but the relationship with the state and with the dominant group has been different. There's often uh, a different perception and kind of a willingness sometimes to be part of some of these developments because they see it as like we don't want to be left behind type of
I see.
like we have been left behind in the past and it's kind of this this AI train, it's gonna leave without us if we don't jump on it.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think that both approaches are completely valid, like wanting to participate and not wanting to participate. At the end of the day, I think it's the community's decision. Um, I think that like when there's this mindset, or it's not this mindset, but this like approach of like we want to be part of it, I think, as you said, like there's some ideas to like what they want to get out of it. Uh, and I think, phones are so ubiquitous right now, and people often want to be able to like type in their languages, or want to be able to have like a spell checker in their language, and want to be able to like interact with technology meaningfully in their language. And at some point, it's kind of like you have to like backtrack the steps that are required to develop that, to figure out what it is that the community needs to have basically in
Yeah,
place. I
yeah.
don't I don't know if this is a good answer. I guess I'm trying to approach it from a not from a place of judgment, but more from a place of like different people have different needs,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's hard to anticipate. We kind of know what steps go into developing a specific thing like a spell checker, right? And so
Hmm.
it's like, if that's what you want, this is the type of thing that has to be in place in terms of
Hmm.
like language
Yeah.
materials.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Like, if you've seen some communities, maybe they want to use technology for revitalization efforts or teaching efforts or, something to bring into schools. But
Mhm.
maybe it's something like, there's a community that maybe wants payroll software in their language, or they want an app to, you know, pay for the laundry so they don't have to
Mhm.
put quarters in the machine, or a dating app or whatever.
Right, right, right,
And I guess, those examples are maybe a little silly, but I mean, uh, things that everybody kind of has to engage with
right.
at some point or another all over the world. So I was just wondering if there were any like specific things that you noticed people were particularly in need
Yeah,
of or desiring.
I think it's hard to generalize in the sense that, we talk about indigenous languages, but then there's all this like big bucket of like low resource languages, which is basically the- there's so many things that end up in that bucket.
Mm.
Um, like Catalan is considered a low resource language, or even like languages like Estonian might be considered low resource languages, which is like, wait a minute, but these are languages that have sizable communities, they have sizable like funding and support from states. Um, it's just that they haven't received the same attention to, like, say, English, right? And so, and if you go to like even major languages in Africa, like I don't know, Yoruba or Zulu, or you name it. I mean,
Hmm.
some of those languages that have again sizable populations are often nowhere to be found. And there's a lot of initiative, I think, uh, to to precisely do the things that you're talking about in the sense of like dating apps, or uh, apps to pay for your laundry, or whatever it is. I think that the question, or like, it becomes very different depending on like the community and the size of the community and the
Yeah.
resources
Okay.
and the context that they're in. And I think that a smaller community might not even be thinking about certain things, because it might seem, um, yeah, I think that there might be like more immediate needs that, say, a Yoruba speaker that is more likely to have a spell checker can start thinking about other things that they want, if
Hmm.
if if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And thank you for pointing out also low resource languages can even be languages that have millions, if not tens of millions of speakers.
Mhm.
So that's like another conversation.
For sure.
It's
Yeah.
like we have three conversations into one in this conversation that we're having. So we need you need to come back. We need to do a part two and a part three and talk more about this because I think it's important and like I said, I'm not an expert. I'm not a linguist, but there's so many things that I want to understand and I think are important to understand as we're thinking about language and I want people to think more about language because we all do language. To
Right,
paraphrase the great Toni Morrison, we all do language.
right,
And just understanding that it's it's not just this thing in the background that's kind
right.
of orbiting our brains, it's so much more important. And the dynamics and the power dynamics are
Right.
so important. And I also realize I'm in a huge place of privilege to be able to even talk about this so openly, because a lot of people around the world are not able to. And I don't take that for granted. So this was a lot of information that I'm really so happy to have this conversation with you. And I believe me when I say there's so much more I want to ask you. And I just, we're just doing this in the interest of time. I want to know if you can talk about the work that you do at Meta. I
Mm.
know that some Meta employees are not really allowed to say too much, but can you talk about what you do? And if so,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, let me say that you are probably a linguist by association and by doing this podcast for so long. So don't discredit yourself in that way. Um, but yeah, I've been on assignment at Meta for slightly over a year now, going to a year and a half. I'm in the fair part of Meta, which is fundamental AI research, which traditionally is a lot of just basically research. It's very like academia adjacent, if you want.
Okay.
And we're part of Linguist that kind of supports different like language projects. So we don't necessarily have our own projects. We kind of support different needs that people have,
Okay.
which is very interesting in the sense that you just get to see a lot of different projects that people are going through, and it's kind of very varied in that way. I've been more kind of involved with this team on omnilinguality, and there's two big projects that we've put out in the last couple of months. One is an ASR model, an automatic speech recognition model that's open source, and then there's a machine translation model. And both, I think, have capabilities for about like, I think, 1,600 languages, which is the first of their kind to
Mm-hmm.
have that amount of breadth. The ASR model is open source and has zero shot capabilities, and so you can like download the model and fine tune it for a language. So, for example, Yukaghir is not one of the languages uh, that has been in the training set. But I could download the model and then just use the Yukaghir recordings to the recordings and then the transcriptions of those recordings to um, basically fine tune it so it can recognize that language for a specific
Okay.
purpose. If I
Okay.
want to then have like a small, say, model for the community.
Mm-hmm.
So that opens a lot of opportunities for folks around the world. It has that kind of multilingual base that then can be leveraged, all these like cross lingual learning that people have talked about for a while, where even if you have small amounts of data from one particular language, it can leverage what it has learned about all the other languages that it has seen and kind of apply that.
Okay.
So that's some of the work that I've been doing. Also with the machine translation project, we've put out an evaluation, a benchmark data set for, I want to say like 275 languages, which is the biggest benchmark for machine translation. It's all parallel, so the sentences and the paragraphs are the same for all 275 languages.
Wow.
So it's been some like massive work that has been very rewarding because once you start going into, these many languages, you get to move away from the the typical suspects that we're talking about, and you really get to engage with more communities, and we've had some partnerships. So that has been quite exciting to
Yeah,
to do.
that is really exciting. I know you mentioned that Yukaghir is not a part of it, but how about Mistec?
Yeah, I think there's some mistake languages in in the ASR model for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So this is promising. Do we know if there are any plans to add more to that set?
Well, I don't think I think that gets into the territory that I can't say
Okay.
more.
You signed the NDA and we shall ask no more.
So I can tell you what's out there.
I got it.
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah.
We do not want you getting in trouble. Um, No, this is really cool. This is really, really cool. And thank you for sharing what you're working on. I should have asked you this at the beginning of our chat, but I was tripping over this word and I was embarrassed. But now I'm going to ask you, when you're saying omnilinguality, what does that mean?
So I think there's this idea or this I don't know if it's an idea, but this push to kind of move into like, omni from Greek means
Hmm.
all. So this idea of like building language technology systems that can serve all languages, right?
Okay.
And so it's moving towards again this kind of zero shot capabilities and cross-lingual learning that I was just mentioning,
Hmm.
of building systems that then can be extended and adapted for other languages, and maybe that's something that people or communities can do. Take like an off-the-shelf open source model and build on top of it with materials and recordings
Okay.
that they might have.
Okay. Okay, I like that. I was going in the other direction until you said omni from the Greek, meaning all. And I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
thinking one. And I'm like, wait, we don't
yeah.
all want to speak one language. So, and that doesn't make sense in this context anyway. But thank you for explaining that. And I should have asked you that earlier. Um, this is really exciting and I'm happy to talk about this with you because I think that at least for me, I think when you don't really understand AI and what it can do, and you don't understand kind of the benefits of it, aside from the more sinister implications that
Mhm.
we often hear about, I think hearing that there can be so much good done for languages with AI is really refreshing for
Mhm.
me to hear because my first instinct is to say, oh no, they're going to take away our power with
Right.
machines and they're going to take away our character with machines. So it's really refreshing to me to hear that people who are doing the work that you are actually thinking about the context and thinking about the culture and what people say and how people talk to one another, and that knowing that there are people out there who are not ignoring that is really refreshing to me. So thank you for talking with us about that and sharing that.
And thank you for also, bringing up that there is another side. I mean, I think that we all live with contradictions, and I also see that side of things, and I don't want to like brush it under the rug and pretend it's not there. I mean, there are concerns and there are practices that I think are questionable. And I think about people like Emily Bender, who's been this amazing job at kind of really putting a light on some of those like more opaque sides of AI and some of the implications and maybe like bringing down some of these like grandiose claims that we see in tech. Um, I think that both things can coexist. I think that can exist, and I think that we have to think about how we build technologies that serve everyone and
Hmm.
every language speaker, and how do we bring more people with more perspectives into building technology. And I think going back to what you said earlier, I mean, language is everywhere. And I think it's very tempting, especially when you study a language and when you think of yourself as a language scientist, to just dissect it and just clean it up and just in the way that other sciences work. But you cannot separate the economic piece. You cannot separate the history piece. You cannot separate any of it. The
Yeah,
language exists in a very complex web that
right.
and in all the complex webs that we exist as humans. And so we I think that leaning it too much it does more harm than good sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. I try to remember also that we're kind of at the beginning of this conversation um about, AI, and maybe the public at large is more or less at the beginning of this conversation. And I say this to also cheer myself up a little, like I'm sure people were having these kind of conversations when the steam engine was invented or when they first saw, a light bulb. And
Mhm.
there was something that was new and maybe fracturing the way that people thought about well, what does this mean for me? What does this
Right.
mean for my loved ones? What does this mean for my community? And
Right.
now, we see a train and we don't think twice about it, or we see
Right.
a jumbo jet and we don't think it's crazy. But there was a point in time where air travel was like new
Right.
and divisive and weird, and who would want to use this? And then there were people on the other side who were saying, look how great this is and what this is going to do for humanity and society. So that's what I mean when I say we're at the beginning of it. Like, I think a lot of us are just wrapping our heads around it and just trying to make our way through it and understand it. And then I think going through it, or having gone through this for a while and having AI as a part of our lives, I think, we'll look at it differently, or we'll look back at it differently. So these conversations are important to have. And even if we don't have the answers, I don't think there are answers at this point in time. We just have to kind of do the best that we can and try to be as ethical as we can, I
Be
think.
critical and just try to build technologies that serve people. I think that at the end of the day, for me, that's what matters.
Mhm.
Like I agree that we're in this kind of moment that is all very new. And at the same time, the field of artificial intelligence has been around for decades.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that as it becomes more and more entangled in our lives, we have to ask harder and harder questions.
Hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much for this
Thank you.
conversation. This has
Thank you for
really
having me.
been eye-opening. And like I said, please come back because we have so much more. We have so much more to talk about. I know you have a podcast, and
Yeah.
I would love for you to tell us about your podcast.
Yeah, so with a couple of friends from Barcelona, we started a podcast about linguistics. We basically are interviewing linguists or any person that works with language in lots of different ways. They just kind of get just talk and learn and see what it is that they're working with, and we kind of want to reflect again like languages in so many different ways, and you find people that work in areas that you wouldn't even know a linguistic background could be
Yeah.
used. So I
Hmm.
think it's a little bit of this kind of almost professionalization lens to it of just showing and just advocating for more people to learn about linguistics and see all the amazing things that you can do with
Yeah.
linguistics.
Do you have a name for this
We
podcast?
do, yeah.
Okay.
It's called Linguistas de Capçalera,
Hmm.
which kind of hard to translate. It's a little bit of a play of words. So the capsalera is you would typically use it with doctor. It's like your GP.
Okay.
So it's this kind of like play of words on like your linguist GP, your kind of like
Oh,
your reference linguist that you go to with your language questions.
okay. And how many languages are we podcasting in?
We're just doing it. Well, we're doing it in Catalan.
Okay.
We might consider doing like a multilingual situation where, other Romance languages that can be easy to understand for a speaker of Catalan, where someone can speak in Galician or speak in Italian or speak in like Lombard or speak in other, again, trying to create a space where people don't have to always change
Yeah.
their language.
Hmm.
But the thread is Catalan.
Okay.
Yeah,
Exciting.
yeah.
Well, I'll put the name of it in the show notes.
Okay.
I can put the
Awesome.
link in there, so that's no problem.
Thank you.
Um, I have had so much fun learning
Same.
from you and talking with you in this episode. And I just want to say thank you again so much for this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for all these amazing questions and these are things that I ask myself. So it's refreshing to hear another perspective.
Yeah. I like to end each episode with the same question. Um, and you're gonna have a big pool to choose from for this one. Like a humongous Siberia-sized pool to choose from for this one. But do you have any jokes, popular sayings, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in any of your languages to share and to teach us?
I'll give you something a little different if you let me.
Sure.
I'll give you a place name in Wales that is the longest place name in Europe that is actually made up. But it's Llanfair Pwll Gwyngyll Gogerach Gwyndrapol Llantysilio Go Go Go. And it was next to where I lived. And people don't really use the whole place name all the time, but there's like
Hmm.
a song for you to learn how to say it.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that it's just like a playful. They changed the name of the town to bring tourism, and it worked because they had this, and the train station name is kind of funny.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I think you might be the third person to give me that
Oh,
name.
really? Oh no.
I'll accept it. I'll accept it. And
Okay.
instead of asking you to choose another one, I will ask you, when you first went there, what did you do? What was your experience like?
I I think I've only been to a train station to take a
The
picture, to
train
be honest
station.
with you.
Okay, 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 okay.
Um, but I think it's I mean Welsh is very vibrant in the north.
Hmm.
Uh, I I remember so I was in Bangor the first when I was doing my master's, and then I was in Carnarvon, which is the neighboring town,
Hmm.
where the majority of people speak Welsh. And in fact, if you hear someone speaking English, you assume it's a tourist because most of the locals, even people that would speak English at home, they just speak
Very
um,
cool.
Welsh. And so I kind of became a little bit because I had a Catalan flag on my window, and I just kind of became the Catalan in town, and I it was an amazing experience in the sense of just being immersed in the language, and it also makes you realize how important having those spaces are for a language where the language can be vibrant, and it's
Yeah,
just you can walk up to a stranger and just speak Welsh and know that they're going to understand and not have to like hide the language, I think.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Very cool.
So I don't know if that was a lot of wisdom, but maybe some food for
No,
thought.
no, definitely. And thank you for sharing that. And I always appreciate the answers to those questions because um, they always come from the heart.
Mhm.
So that's always important to me. Albert, thank you again for
Thank
this
you.
conversation. Before I let you go, you have another opportunity here. If you've been talking to someone for quite some time about language,
Hmm.
um, but now it's time for you to go your separate ways, what is the best way to say goodbye?
Uh,
In any language, the first one that comes to
yeah.
mind, don't overthink it.
I think in Catalan it's just like adeu, fins la propera. Fins
Ad,
aviat. Fins
ad,
aviat, I think. Yeah.
fins aviat?
Yeah. Yeah.
Adeu, fins aviat?
Yep. Very good.
Aldeu, fins aviat? Albert, thank you
Fins
again.
aviat.
Fins aviat. Thank you so much again, and I'll be talking to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
New episodes of Speaking Tongues are available every Monday, 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to like and share episodes with other language lovers like yourselves.